Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Julia Rothkopf, and I'm the Program Associate at YIVO. Today we are hosting a panel discussion, Yiddish on the Move, Yiddish Writing and Publishing After the Holocaust. And we're very excited to be hosting this because this panel grows out of a working group that is busy developing the forthcoming volume, Cambridge History of Holocaust Literature. And YIVO is so excited to be hosting this working group this weekend. So for those of you who do not know YIVO, we are a very special place for the exploration, contemplation, and celebration of Eastern European Jewish life and culture. We are located in New York City, where our vast library and archival collections contain over 24 million documents, 400,000 books. And these resources are used by researchers from all around the world, including those who are part of this working group. We also have lots of classes on Yiddish language and culture, exhibitions, and public programs just like this one, where we aim to bridge the world with our vast archival collections and Jewish culture. And before I turn over to our panelists, I would like to just quickly thank the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council for sponsoring the working group. Now I'll turn it over to our panelists. Thank you so much.
So good evening, everybody. Welcome to the panel, Yiddish on the Move, Yiddish Writing and Publishing After the Holocaust. My name is Erin McLaughlin, and I'm the Gloria M. Goldstein Professor of Holocaust Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm particularly pleased to introduce and moderate this panel, which is held in conjunction with a workshop that will take place here at YIVO tomorrow and on Sunday, and that is associated with the research project that Julia mentioned, entitled Rethinking Holocaust Literature, Contexts, Canons, Circulations. Funded by the United Kingdom Arts and Humanities Research Council, this project aims to present a new history of Holocaust literature through a dynamic understanding of its multiple levels of operation and the way these levels interconnect and interact, particularly across temporal periods, geographical and political borders, and languages. The central output of this project is the forthcoming Cambridge History of Holocaust Literature, which will include the contributions of over 40 internationally acclaimed experts in the field of Holocaust literature. But the project also encompasses a volume titled New Approaches to Teaching Holocaust Literature, as well as an extensive public engagement program. On behalf of the project team, which includes Stuart Taberner, McKenna Marco, and Dion Otosaka from the University of Leeds, as well as Christine Zulka and me from Washington University in St. Louis, I want to express appreciation to YIVO for hosting one of the first events in that public engagement program. In particular, I'd like to give heartfelt thanks to Julia Rothkopf for all the work she put in to make tonight happen. We are excited to partner with YIVO to discuss one important area of focus in the project, namely the dynamics of Yiddish writing and publishing across transnational literary networks after the Holocaust, and the role these networks played in the emerging canon of Holocaust literature. The destruction of Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jewry and its established cultural centers during the Holocaust necessitated a complex reevaluation of the relationships between the former Yiddish literary capitals, which included Łódź, Warsaw, Vilnius, and New York, and new emerging Yiddish centers of Buenos Aires and Montreal. A particularly intriguing case is the literary production in the Soviet territory behind the Iron Curtain. These structural dynamics intricately link the multifaceted roles of writers, editors, translators, and ultimately publishers. Our four panelists will address these topics through the lens of their own areas of research. Each of them will give us a brief presentation, after which I'll pose some questions to the panel at large. We'll then open the panel up to questions from the audience. So let's get to know our speakers. Our first speaker is Harriet Mirov, Marjorie Roberts Professor in Liberal Arts and Sciences and a Center for Advanced Study at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. The author of 6 monographs, 5 co-edited books, and numerous articles on Russian and Yiddish literature and culture from an interdisciplinary and comparative perspective, Murov has also co-translated David Bergelson's Judgment and is co-translating a selection of Yiddish and Russian stories in The Shadow of War, Russian Jewish Writers After the Holocaust, which is under contract with Stanford University Press. Indiana University Press recently published her study of the literary and documentary response to the pogroms of the Russian Civil War, As the Dust of the Earth, the Literature of Abandonment in Revolutionary Russia and Ukraine. Her new project focuses on the theme of time, waiting, and wartime in contemporary Ukrainian poetry. Our second speaker will be Matt Johnson, Associate Senior Lecturer in Yiddish at Lund University in Sweden. His research is broadly comparative, with a focus on Yiddish, German, and English language literature and cultural history from the 18th century to the present. He also has broad research and teaching interests in film, photography, and other media, translation theory and practice, gender studies, and the representation and memory of the Holocaust. He is currently completing a book with the working title Faltering Language on German Yiddish Literature, which investigates how writers variously understood and reinterpreted the relationship between German and Yiddish in the long 20th century. He is also working on a larger scale research project about the reception history of the memoirs of Glickel Bas Jude-Leib, or Glickel von Hameln, and about the media history of testimony. Next, we'll hear from Rochelle Grossman, Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Her work, which focuses on the intersection of Yiddish and its transnational connections with other literatures, languages, and cultures, develops a geopolitical approach to literature, focusing especially on the transformation of literary centers and peripheries in the post-war period. She is also interested in technologies of print and how they impact literature as material culture. Her 2023 dissertation, titled Cultural Capitals, Post-War Yiddish Between Warsaw and Buenos Aires, was chiefly concerned with the story of Yiddish after the Holocaust and the prolific publishing endeavors of cultural activists around the world. Our last speaker is Christine Zulke, postdoctoral research fellow in Holocaust literature at Washington University in St. Louis. She is also a team member of the project Rethinking Holocaust Literature, Context, Canon, Circulations, and she's an associate editor for the forthcoming Cambridge History of Holocaust Literature. Her research focuses on Jewish experiences and responses to the Holocaust, with a specific emphasis on gender and religious aspects. Her dissertation focused on the Yiddish writings of the Sonderkommando in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and her postdoctoral research examines Jewish masculinities in the writings of Elie Wiesel. She is co-editor of the Elie Wiesel Research Series, as well as the annotated 24-volume German edition, Elie Wiesel Werke. She recently co-published a volume entitled New Microhistorical Approaches to an Integrated History of the Holocaust. So please welcome my panel here. So we'll start with Harriet Murov.
Thank you very much for a generous introduction and for the honor and opportunity to be with you this evening. The Holocaust is part of a specific cultural identity for American Jews, and what has become known as Holocaust literature also has a specific trajectory, which we're going to explore over the next few days. The term Holocaust, however, was not used in the former Soviet Union until the 1990s, although Yiddish authors used the traditional word for destruction, Churbim, and therefore the term Soviet Jewish or Soviet Holocaust literature is misleading. The killings carried out by Nazis and their collaborators on Soviet soil did not typically take place in death camps, but in killing sites near urban areas. Baba Yar is only one such yar, or ravine. Soviet Jews who survived the German occupation because they had been evacuated or served in the army returned to make their homes where mass killings had occurred. And the work of Annika Walker is exploring what that feels like in Belarus. The celebration of victory in the so-called Great Patriotic War was and continues to be a fundamental aspect of Soviet and post-Soviet life. Official silence about the unique fate of Jews killed as Jews did not preclude other forms of commemoration in both literature and daily life. Soviet Yiddish and Russian Jewish authors produced poetry, both lyric and epic, Peretz Markish's massive 2-volume Milchoma, War. They produced short prose, for example, works by Dir Nister, Russian language work by Vasily Grossman, Itzik Kipnis, David Bergelson, Shira Gorshman, Rivka Rubin, and many others. They produced dramatic works, David Bergelson's Prince Ruveni, set during the time of the Inquisition, but about the Holocaust, which they didn't call the Holocaust. This body of work shares key features with what we call Holocaust literature, but the specificity of the Soviet context, the emphasis on Soviet victory, the factor of Cold War cultural politics have blocked the place that Bergelston, Hofstein, Markish, and other Soviet Yiddish and Russian language authors should have in Holocaust literature as a system. This paper focuses on Hofstein and Bergelson, who directly engage the questions of witnessing, testimony, and mourning. These issues have been central, as you know, to Holocaust theory and scholarship, including the work of Derrida, Feldman, Agamben, and many others, but Soviet Yiddish is virtually excluded from these discussions. The rare work of scholarship that discuss Bergelson or Hofstein or Markish tend to evaluate the Soviet ideological components of their writing, reading their prose and poetry as indices of ideological pressure and not as works of literature whose temporality, addressivity, performativity, imagery, diction, emotion, and aesthetics require literary and not merely ideological analysis. The picture is changing, and everyone in this room is part of that story, but there are many gaps. So I'm going to spend the rest of my brief remarks looking more closely at two works of Soviet Yiddish literature that have not been discussed together. David Hofstein's very interesting 1944 poem, Und wieder a Welt, and again a world, notice 1944, and Bergelson's An Edis, a Witness, published in 1947, although earlier version appeared in 1945 in the newspaper of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, Einigkeit. I am presently co-translating this story for the collection mentioned earlier. Both works explore what it means to be a witness and a mourner, a key theme of the literature of mass destruction, highlighting the witness's isolation, the difficulty of finding an addressee, and the precarious and even imagined community of witnesses. Hofstein was born in 1889. He was a leading modernist who came to prominence in the 1920s. He's very famous for his pogrom lament, Treuer, Sorrow, published in 1922. He and Bergelson served on the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. Both were murdered by Stalin in 1952. And both are amazing, wonderful authors who are very seriously under-translated. So Hofstein does an interesting thing in his 1944 Und wieder a Welt, and again a world. He interprets the Nazi genocide as a repetition of the destruction of Jewish lives during the pogroms of the Russian Civil War. The speaker, isolated by his bitter destiny, is the only one who laments the destruction of, quote, two worlds. And again, a world has fallen. Hush. Am I the only one with a bitter luck, destined to the sad fate of lamenting two worlds? How long ago was it? A quarter century has passed, and again, on trembling seas of fear, the wreck of your ships heaves and sways without destination on the scummy waves of disaster. That's my translation. So the poem repeats a key set of lines from his earlier 1922 work, which begins, "Und widere Welt," and again a world, eingefallen, has fallen, und schah. So the repetition of history is built into the structure of the poem with the repetitions of the poet's own earlier text. But there's a puzzle. Why is he saying he's the only one? Why is he saying it's his own miserable fate? Surely there are other people around who saw what happened in 1917 to 22 and lived to see what happened during the German occupation. So Hochstein presents the witness and mourner as terribly, terribly isolated. The hero of Bergelson's story, an Edis, a witness, also makes a claim to unique singularity. The story begins with an unnamed Jew, just referred to as a Yid, a Jew, standing in the dilapidated entranceway of a building, and a passerby, Dora, feels as if the Jew is addressing her. Even though he doesn't speak, she approaches him and says, "Me? Do you need me?" And the witness, even before he speaks, therefore, and before we know what he's going to say, creates some kind of obligation in the other. The witness needs an addressee. The Jew, who remains just der Yid, or der alter Yid, the old Jew throughout the story, identifies himself as a witness, "Ich bin ein Edis." But Dora doesn't know what he means. The woman wanted to comprehend what the Jew meant by that. Dora's incomprehension focalizes our confusion as readers. Her understanding of the Jew's self-designation dawns little by little. She hears the Jew say that he is, quote, "the only surviving witness," and asks him, who is not a witness today? Wer ist denn heint nicht kein Edis? So this is 1947, and an early version appeared in 1945. So everyone alive is a survivor and a witness. Everyone experienced something during the war that transformed his or her entire being into only one identity, that of a witness. In the story, Dora agrees to transcribe and translate what the witness says. He speaks in Yiddish. She translates it on the fly into Russian and writes it down in Russian. The story is in Yiddish. Every now and then she stops and says, "Have I got it right?" And the witness says, "What can I tell you? Die Tzuris sind gewesen auf Yiddish." The troubles were in Yiddish. Okay, a great question about whether testimony, how you render testimony, what language you can render testimony in, and whether it's renderable at all. Okay, the conclusion. I hope I've given you enough sort of tantalizing hints to suggest that even this bare minimum sampling of Soviet Yiddish literature on the Nazi genocide shows that this body of work offers ample food for thought about really rich questions. Who is a witness? What does it mean to be a witness? What does it mean to give testimony? What is the best language to give testimony in? And there's a paradox going on. Each witness feels as if he is the only one, and yet he is surrounded by a world of witnesses. All testimony must be written down. All testimony must be translated, and yet it can't be. Die Tzuris sind gewesen auf Yiddish. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin, and to the organizers. It's really an honor to be on this panel with everyone, and thank you, everyone, for coming. I am going to talk a little bit, hopefully, like, in a little bit of like kind of bullet point language, trying to get some ideas out there, but primarily about a particular example, the work of Chava Rosenfarb, who some people in this audience have worked on quite extensively. And I want to raise just a few general issues and point to this concrete example that I think give a picture of at least certain aspects of how Yiddish literature, and in particular literature written by survivors, did and did not circulate across borders and across languages in the wake of the Holocaust. So if we're thinking about like what moves and what doesn't move, I mean, you're also looking at examples that didn't really move necessarily across languages in the same way that other texts did. So the first point I want to raise is that this picture of the kind of development of Holocaust literature in the post-war years looks very different if we're talking about the circulation of Yiddish literature in Yiddish, or if we're talking about the circulation of Yiddish literature in translation. This may be a somewhat obvious point, but I think it's an important one, because many, though not all, Yiddish language writers during the post-war period were thinking very intensively about what we might call the problem of translation. The sense that the fate of Yiddish literature was bound up in translation in certain ways, and in particular that this corpus that we call, however problematically, Holocaust literature was arguably dependent on translation into other languages. And I'll focus today, very briefly on English, but translations into French, into Hebrew, and other languages also played an important role in the initial post-war decades. So one example that I think really kind of illuminates and testifies to some of these larger dynamics is that of Chava Rosenfarb. Very kind of brief background, born in Poland in 1923 in a Yiddish-speaking family, survives the Lodz ghetto, and then later Auschwitz, Sachsen, Bergen-Belsen. In the ghetto, Rosenfarb begins writing in Yiddish. She starts writing a little earlier, but she begins writing seriously in Yiddish. And in the ghetto, she finds, despite the kind of horrific conditions, she finds a vibrant literary milieu. She describes it later as a kind of epidemic of writing that had taken hold in the ghetto. And one of the things that just to highlight here that I think many people that are contributing to this volume, David Roskis and others, have really highlighted this focus on literature produced in the ghettos and camps. Miriam Tren, Sven Erik Rose has a forthcoming book about this issue. This poetry that was produced in the ghettos and camps is literature that by and large did not circulate at a large scale and was largely not translated. So when we're thinking about these larger dynamics, this is by and large a corpus that did not move, or with very few exceptions. Rosenfarb, her poetry that she produced in the Lodz ghetto was confiscated at selection in Auschwitz, and this poetry she then remembers and rewrites after the war. And so her poetry does begin to circulate in Yiddish in the post-war years, and some of it is translated. I'll mention that in a bit later. But this is still like a very kind of particular corpus of remembered poetry or of rewritten poetry. And what I just want to highlight here is that she survives the war. She had become kind of a poet in the ghetto, and then she finds herself as a DP, as so many other survivor writers did. She begins to publish in Yiddish periodicals. She begins to, two of her volumes of poetry are published in slightly different editions in the United Kingdom and in Canada. But just to skip around a little bit so that we can, in the interest of time, what I want to highlight is not just that she was publishing and in quite a large scale in these early post-war years in Yiddish, but also that she found herself participating in a larger network of Yiddish writers that was not focused just on publication, but also on material support. So in her archive, there are many letters with the Yiddish Pen Club, with figures like Aleph Leilis, who was working for the club, who were providing not just publication support, but also financial support, putting her in contact with others who could help. And her publisher, her Canadian publisher, was the one who got her, helped her immigrate to Canada itself. So one of the points I just want to make is that when we're talking about Yiddish on the move, we're not just talking about the circulation or dissemination of texts, but also the movement or migration of individuals. And that the movement of texts and people wasn't necessarily separate. Many publishers and more established writers were directly involved in helping survivor writers immigrate out of post-war Europe. And the movement of people, of course, meant that sites of literary production and publication moved, but texts and the larger literary field also sometimes help people move. So it's not just about like Yiddish literature circulating, but also the literary infrastructure in Yiddish helped some of these writers themselves immigrate or move. I'm basically gonna skip the very interesting and significant work that Rosenfarb does in translating and self-translating. I'm happy to talk about it more if there's time. But one of the things just I want to highlight in the work I'm doing for this volume, and that other people have been thinking about as well in relation to her work, is she published a massive amount of prose. Her earlier work is in Yiddish, but a massive amount of prose in Yiddish in the post-war decades. At the same time, she was struggling and largely failing to find an audience beyond Yiddish. So at the same time she composes this monumental trilogy, The Tree of Life, she's also writing in a relatively desperate kind of nature to translators, to publishers, trying to find a larger audience. And one of the things that I think is important to think about is how to characterize this period. Many scholars like Jens Schwartz and Rivka Margolis have really emphasized the kind of ongoing creativity and vitality of Yiddish literature long after the Holocaust. Rosenfarb testifies to this. Her work is an example of the kind of enduring energy and creative energy of Yiddish literature long into the late 20th century. At the same time, she's thinking in very negative and even desperate kind of tones about the constriction and the diminishment of the Yiddish readership. And it's not, I think sometimes there's a tendency to emphasize one or the other, but both are true. The kind of ongoing creativity and creative energy, as well as this depletion of a readership and the fracturing of the literary infrastructure. And so just to kind of conclude, one of the things that's very, I think, important about her archive is that she kept many of these rejection letters. And I don't think that's just something to, that was a kind of intentional act. And I'll end by noting that her failure to find a translator in the 50s and 60s, her failure when she turned to self-translation into English to get published, this only changes in collaboration with her daughter Goldie Morgenthaler quite a bit later, and the publication itself only happens much later. I think that the fact that Rosenfarb kept many of these letters, these rejection letters, it teaches us that more research needs to be done, not just about the sometimes large gaps between the Yiddish texts and their English translations. This is something that scholars like Nomi Seidman have done with relation to Elie Wiesel. You're doing some of this work as well. But also about the intensive and often failed struggle to make space for Yiddish literature in a globalized era of Holocaust literature, in which languages like English and French dominated. And just to end by saying that the history of Holocaust literature is also about what was left out of this globalized form of its. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Matt, Harriet, Aaron, and the organizers of our workshop this weekend. It's really a pleasure to be here and to speak also to this YIVO audience. I want to keep my remarks on the shorter side so we have time for our conversation, but I do want to pick up on some of the points that my colleagues have brought up here, in particular the question of production and of movement of people and of texts, and how my contribution to this panel or roundtable really picks up on some of these ideas. So to kind of anchor us, I want you to imagine with me a scene I found while reading some materials in the archives. It was an account from the very first typesetters who were able to put together a page of newspaper in 1945 in April. And the process to even get to that point was very difficult because as Jews were being liberated in Eastern Poland, in Lublin, there were cultural activities happening. People were starting to make radio announcements, to make things that they put on the wall for people to read, but there was a real problem because materially there weren't any pieces of Yiddish type that they could set, that they could print from, that things that were being put on the walls were handwritten. They were maybe transliterated in Latin letters. But as Łódź was liberated, word reached Lublin that there was a printing press that had some type that might be salvageable. And so a small group of men went to Łódź and sorted piece by piece, letter by letter, through February, through the winter in the extreme cold, to find a handful of Yiddish type that they could make a single page of Yiddish newspaper. And with this, they printed Das neue Leben, the new life, which became the first Yiddish newspaper printed in post-war Poland in 1945, as I mentioned, and it was an issue that was dedicated to the Yortzeit of Yud Lamed Peretz, okay, this major canonical figure whose 30th Yortzeit also coincided with the end of the war. And so there are a lot of interesting pieces coming together in thinking about the production of this literature, because it was a moment to celebrate this grand canonical figure, and also a way to participate in a larger global conversation happening about this figure, which was an occasion also to begin to start to come to terms with the destruction of European Jewry, in particular, in this case, with Yiddish-speaking Jewry in this moment. So we have this event happening in Łódź. Rochel Auerbach writes an article in tribute to Peretz, in which she also gives an account of Warsaw in those years, in which Peretz's Ohel, his monument in the cemetery, is miraculously still standing and is perhaps, what she says, the only remaining Jewish building in the former Jewish quarter of the city that was once so vibrant. And so again, the figure of the author comes to dominate this discourse as it is emerging in this very, very early post-war period. Now, at the same time, in Buenos Aires in 1944, getting into 1945, other figures are also trying to think about this moment that is this combination of Peretz's Yortzeit and the end of the war, and the idea to create a new version of Peretz's collected works arises already in 1944 with the explicit idea that when the war ends, Jews in Europe are going to want to rebuild their communities, they're going to rebuild their libraries, and what were they going to need? Books, and Yiddish books, and Yud Lamed Peretz's books must be in those libraries, and so it is, as they said, a tragic and weighty privilege that the Jewish community, the Yiddish-speaking Jewish community in Buenos Aires, has the capacity, materially, financially, and intellectually, to put this together and to send to them as a kind of war relief. So I share these two examples as a way to center the conversation about post-war Yiddish literature within the context of a world coming to terms with the Holocaust, even though this literature is itself not explicitly Holocaust literature. Nevertheless, it's being put into use as a kind of practice of mourning, of coming to terms with this world that is no longer in existence. And so Peretz's works, even though they themselves are literary fictions, are also in some ways being transformed as a new kind of literature. And this also leads us to understand a bit more about the dynamics of the changing centers and peripheries for Yiddish production at the time as well. So the idea that in Buenos Aires, this Yiddish diaspora, which is whole in comparison to Europe certainly, that they're able to come together and to create new materials, starts to define a lot of the post-war dynamics of this literary network. And we see other efforts, massive efforts, coming out of Buenos Aires. Das Polnische Judentum is a huge series in which many different works of Holocaust literature, in particular Elie Wiesel's Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, Katzetnik's The House of the Dolls, other works are being published in this volume, or in this series as well. And so I hope we can talk a bit about the movement of works. There's much to say about also the different politics during this Cold War period as well, and the ways in which certain things are able to circulate between communist Poland and Argentina in ways that they're not able to circulate between communist Poland and the United States, for example, but that through networks of Yiddish, and in particular leftist Yiddish networks that are enabled by the IKUF, different kinds of texts are able to move around, even as the people who are writing them may not be able to. So I'm going to leave this here, and hopefully we can continue this conversation in our roundtable.
Hello, everyone. I want to build on what was said before. Thanks first for having me. As a former student of the YIVO summer program, I'm really excited to be here and be part of the roundtable. And I want to put the emphasis on translation, what is translated into which languages, and especially how it is translated. And I will give 2 examples. I want to keep it also brief. My first example are the Yiddish testimonies of the Sonderkommando in Auschwitz-Birkenau. They were written in 1943 and 44 by 3 Polish Jews and were buried in metal and glass vessels in the ground of the crematoria. So they were written while these prisoners were doing forced labor in the Sonderkommando in the gas chambers and crematoria. And they were found over a period stretching from 1945, shortly after the liberation, until 1970s. So that's a huge period. And this is a topic in itself. These manuscripts were published in 2 books in the 70s, both coming from Israel, published in Israel, in Jerusalem, and Tel Aviv. One was the writings by Zalman Gradowski, which were published as In the Heart of Hell, in the Hearts von Gehinnom, edited by Chaim Wolnemann, and the other one was a compilation by Bear Mark, which brought together the writings of the 3 Sonderkommando prisoners, which was published as Megillus Auschwitz, the Scrolls of Auschwitz. And these were published in parallel, but without much knowledge of both of them, of the different work. And the work by Gradowski is until now more translated into different languages. There is a newer translation into English, which was published 2 years ago. There's a German translation, which was published in 2019, whereas Megillus Auschwitz was translated once into English in the 1980s, and you can already see the difference. Also, Gradowski's work has reached a bigger audience, for example, by being integrated into David Roski's Literature of Destruction, which was published in the 80s. So there is already a difference in what is getting translated and what reaches a non-Yiddish speaking and global audience. If we look at the Sonderkommando testimonies, which are coming from the same source, you could say, from the same group of prisoners. And if we look at my second example, Elie Wiesel's Yiddish memoir Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, this is also a different case. He started writing shortly after the liberation and published in Das Polnische Judentum, as Rochelle already mentioned, in 1956 as volume 117 in Argentina, as Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, and it was 2 years later already adapted, was an entirely new version, you could say, into English. And 2 years later, it was published first into French, as La Nuit, 2 years later as Night into English. So a really fast translation, you could say, reached a global audience and was available to a global audience. And scholars as Alan Astro and also Naomi Seidman pointed out that there is a huge difference between the Yiddish original and the French and English adaptation. About 1/3 was cut out. Often Yiddish, Jewish references, religious references, but also Wiesel's internal struggle is more described in the original. So you can already see that with the change in translation and what is actually translated, the audience get a different version of the testimony. So this means that with these 2 examples, we already see that they are published in different decades, in a different speed, translated into different languages. And this means also it reaches a different kind of audience at a different time, and also with a different audience in mind. For example, Und die Welt hat geschwiegen was translated and adapted and heavily edited into La Nuit in the French version for a French audience and also for a Christian audience. This is why a lot of the Jewish references were edited out. So we already see there's a totally different readership and audience in mind. And I'm happy to elaborate later on this. And maybe we can start now with the Q&A, with the questions, and go deeper into the different topics. Thank you.
I don't know, is this on? It is on, okay. So I've prepared a few questions. Some of them, actually all of them have been hit on at some point, but I want to go into a little bit more depth with this larger topic of Yiddish literature after the Holocaust, Yiddish literature about the Holocaust, Yiddish literature in the Holocaust canon. So there's sort of permutations of this story and what we want to investigate here. And I think Rochelle especially touched on this, but I want to think about Yiddish literature in the wake of the Holocaust as you have this pre-Holocaust Yiddish really fundamentally diverse and rich and very vibrant literary scene in places like Vilna, Warsaw, Łódź, also New York. What happens when you have those cultural centers? They're destroyed. What happens to both the literature itself and the readership for the literature? And how do we see this shift happening? And how is that shift being registered by the writers of the moment?
Is this on?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So I'll start us off, I suppose. This is something that I do quite a bit of work on. But I mean, I think it's important what you just did here where you mentioned, okay, also New York, right? That there are these centers that are in Europe that are also in conversation with one another and also with this Yiddish diaspora. Definitely New York, and this is also, I'm not only talking about the post-war, obviously. This is just sort of a interwar characteristics of Yiddish literature as already a transnational network between Moscow, New York, Warsaw, Vilna, and so on. And what I see in this post-war period is this diaspora, these places, not just New York, but okay, Montreal, Buenos Aires, Tel Aviv, other places really rise, the diaspora rises to meet this moment. And in doing so, there are interesting tensions that arise when people are also moving from Łódź to Montreal, or new refugee writers coming to Buenos Aires, and it really enlivens the local cultural moment and the scene there. But it also kind of obscures the reality at the same time, which is that I don't know if you would call them the kind of native-born generation of Yiddish-speaking Jews increasingly are getting more distant from Yiddish. And so there's really a tension there between the Yiddish diaspora, we might call it, and even with their school systems, even with things that are going on culturally, a movement away from Yiddish, and Yiddish refugee writers who are coming to these centers and publishing there and doing work there and having this continued transnational cultural moment. So structurally, I think this is a huge shift. And then in terms of the content, as you mentioned, I think that there is an enormous effort to publish testimonial materials, even aesthetically beautiful things that are still in many ways a kind of testimony or telling of events from the most recent years. And so a real change from what had been very experimental in the interwar period, or even before that, is kind of folkloric move. So there's a different tone to a lot of what is published.
I should add that the Soviet Union, stopped publishing Yiddish for a while, but then it resumed in 1961 because the secret discussion said there's well over 100 living authors and they need something to do. So, I mean, one of the most beautiful and touching stories about Babi Yar is published by Itzik Kipnis. It's called Babi Yar, and, or Babin Yar, as we would say today. Many other works, and not only were works published in Yiddish, they were translated into Russian almost right away. So you can read these works both in Yiddish and in Russian. So Moscow, Kharkiv, Kiev, and many other places, yes, there was a period of silence, but it resumed after 1961, and there was a very strong Moscow-Israel connection as well.
Yeah, I just want to I've learned a lot from Rochelle's work on this issue. So I'll kind of answer in a more like a question. That one thing that I've been thinking about recently with Rosenfarb, but I think this also applies to the Buenos Aires scene. Like, you know, das Polnische Judentum was being published in Argentina. What does it mean for the center to be in Argentina, but the content to be so focused on Polish Jewry? And I think there's similar things with like Rosenfarb's work, where we can emphasize the significance of Montreal, and certainly there remains a very significant Yiddish scene in Montreal, especially around the Jewish Public Library. But Rosenfarb's work was very emphatically, except for some of the short stories, about Poland, or about the Lodz Ghetto, or about not Montreal, with some exceptions. And most of her work was being published in Tel Aviv later on. And so one of the things this isn't to deny the centrality of certain locations, but how to think about the relationship between like the actual geographical space, the kind of imaginary space that's kind of being worked through in the literature, in the publications, and then just like the material reality of like where publishing could happen is something I've been kind of thinking about.
While I listened to what you said, I was also thinking about what is something we don't consider a center. But if we think about the publishing right after the Holocaust, in the first years, a lot of publishing also happened in DP camps. There were pamphlets, there were newspapers, journals, for example, von Letzten Groben. And they happened really quickly. I think it also shows that people wanted to get their testimonials, they wanted to write, they wanted to get their story and perspective out. So there was this publishing, but I'm not sure if we can consider it a center. But I think also in the immediate post-Holocaust years, it was also a little bit dispersed until the movement really started and DPs migrated to the different countries, to the different places, found maybe a forever home or a home for quite some time. So I think especially in the years shortly after Holocaust, it still seems a little bit more messy. And then probably with the establishment of this Polish Judentum, it got more streamlined. I'm not sure if this is the right word, but then these centers really established themselves. Groups were built, communities were built. I think there is also really a process going on with the movement of people at this time and all these different places.
Well, and just to follow up on that, I mean, each one of you is really talking about a moving readership as well. I mean, you mentioned that you have this, let's say New York, you have this readership that 50 years, 40 years before was reading a lot of Yiddish press, a lot of stuff. They're moving away from Yiddish before the survivors are coming in. You mentioned the 100 writers in the Soviet Union. I wonder, was there a readership ready to receive 100 writers? You mentioned, Chava Rosenfarb, who looked for readers her whole life, really. I think that was her search for readers in Yiddish, and then she tries to find that through translation. And then you mentioned the DP camps where you actually have readers desperate, really actively yearning for content. And you can see this like churning sort of movement of the readership in all of these contexts. I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that, but...
I just wanted to say there were readers in the Soviet Union, and they translated it into Russian, which means government spent time and money on print runs. So yes, they believed that there was a readership.
And I'll say just about the Soviet Union, there wasn't Yiddish being published in the Soviet Union for this period of time, but there were things being published in communist Poland, and those works, whether above board or clandestinely, were making their way into the Soviet Union, where they had a large number of readers, both in terms of books, but also with the Volksstimme newspaper. And this was also a way in which certain kinds of news, especially about the murder of the Yiddish poets, made its way out of the Soviet Union by way of the communist Yiddish press in Poland to Buenos Aires, to New York, to other places. And so this Yiddish literary network is functionally also very important in this Cold War moment, trying to get these kinds of pieces of news out there.
I do, this is like a slightly different, but I think it's kind of building on this, and also some of what you are both working on in terms of, I think you called it like the leftist networks of Yiddish literature, but then of course in the Soviet Union. And one book that I'm kind of thinking about in relation with Rosenfarb, something I didn't mention, but also gender plays a very big role in like how these texts are circulating, and what constitutes a center is also gendered, arguably. But one book that I've been interested in recently is Vladka Mead's On Both Sides of the Wall, which was translated into English. This is a text about the Warsaw Ghetto, and it was, and then Elie Wiesel wrote the introduction to the English translation, and he writes, like, the book first appeared in Yiddish in 1948, so it's like an early book. Its publication was an event of significance, for it was the first authentic document to reach the free world about, the loaded argument, but then the English translation completed in 1971 is even more important precisely because it has appeared so late. And one of the things he's pointing to is that this is like a text that's very informed by the Bund, like kind of Bundist ideology, and that at least in the, it's a more complicated, more nuanced story, but what happens to these like networks also that are not necessarily centralized, but they were kind of like orienting forces, like Bundist kind of communities of readers, or left-wing readers, or the opponents thereof. And I think that side of like where the center isn't just so much geographically, but around certain kind of like cultural organizing concepts, that becomes very different in a few decades after.
Yeah, so, okay, maybe now we could think about Yiddish literature and Holocaust literature. I mean, as a part of Holocaust literature, in particular, sort of how Yiddish literature responds to the Holocaust in the first decades, how this literature is received within the Yiddish language world, how it's registered outside of it, and do you see any shared discourse between Yiddish Holocaust literature and this Holocaust literature in other languages? So specifically, I mean, first talking about, just Yiddish literature in general after the Holocaust, but now Yiddish literature of the Holocaust and about the Holocaust.
Well, I think one purpose of us being here at all in this project and here at YIVO is in some ways to rectify the omission of Yiddish as an important, and maybe I would argue a fundamental part of the project of Holocaust literature. That because this language was the language of a majority of the victims of the Holocaust, it should occupy, in my opinion, a much more prominent place, but there, of course, is a tension there because they're victims. They don't have voices to speak about the experience. There's a lot of tensions there. And then additionally, because Yiddish is a minor language or a minor literature, that also plays into the reception of literature in Yiddish about this moment and its larger reception on the world stage. And I think that that's also something that both of your projects work on a lot, translation into Russian, making a body of work more legible, and then of course into English and to other languages as well. So it's sort of, Yiddish seems to only matter to Holocaust literature, at least conventionally, when it can be translated and when it can make an argument that can speak to a larger global world in the way that we see Elie Wiesel's work doing this kind of gesture in a big way.
I don't know, to me it seems self-evident that Yiddish literature about what was not called the Holocaust in the Soviet Union is conversant with and engages profoundly with issues central to scholars of the Holocaust that are sitting in this room. My paper tried to emphasize the paradox of the witness, but I mean, Bergelson's story first appeared in 1945. Hofstein's poem appeared in 1944, so the war wasn't even over yet. So Yiddish writers
in the Soviet Union were responding and articulating the most profound and troubling questions that I don't think entered English language discourse until after 1961.
Well, and I guess my question is, this emerging literature of the Holocaust in other languages, is there a discourse? Is there an interchange? Is there an exchange between the writers of Holocaust literature in other languages, or is this like a sealed off? Are they not aware of what's going on in Yiddish literature, or is there some interchange that we can identify now?
I mean, I think I think there are examples where there was interchange. I think a lot of it was asymmetrical. I think if I just stick with Chava Rosenfarb, although she's there's so many other writers that one could think about. She was thinking very intensively about Paul Celan, for example. Celan was not aware of her work, as there's no evidence that he would. And her essay on Celan is one that's kind of shot through with a lot of frustration that German language writers or kind of writers working in major languages are receiving the attention on a global scale. Celan's kind of a complicated example for a lot of reasons, but just one thing I can add that I think is really important here is, I think it's a kind of oblique answer, is when Rosenfarb was starting to self-translate into English before she started working with her daughter on that, she was producing a lot of like unidiomatic kind of translations, and when she was reaching out to publishing houses, they were often very critical of the language, of the style, but they were also expressing interest in the background of the writer. Like, it's part of the thing we're doing this volume is like, this was a period, 60s, 70s, when Holocaust literature was becoming a kind of globalized, almost commodity. It had a market, and publishing houses were interested in a writer from, who had survived and was from Eastern Europe and was writing about Poland. But I think this is related to some of the stuff you've been working on, and with Wiesel, it has to be also in line with the expectations and norms of an English language literary market. Yeah. And so like that pressure, was on top of like all the other pressures that were facing writers in like other languages. Like the Yiddish writer had to be marketable to a German or Yiddish or French language audience.
And that's another form of translation as well, right? Okay, maybe we could go to the place of Yiddish literature in the early field of Holocaust literary studies, because I find that especially in the English language, there were certainly this first generation of scholars working on Holocaust literature certainly included scholars working on Yiddish, David Roskies, for example. And there were scholars who had familiarity with Yiddish literature, Lawrence Langer, Alvin Rosenfeld, Sidra Ezrahi, James Young. All of them were fairly conversant, at least from the outside, with Yiddish literature and translation. But in general, that field either focused on Western European texts, either in their original languages or in English, or on American Holocaust literature, which is a particular obsession with American Holocaust studies. Where do we see Yiddish in this early scholarship on the Holocaust and the canon that it's created, and where is it missing? And I'm really thinking of this scholarship in the 80s, the early 90s, late 70s, 80s, early 90s. Where is Yiddish? Is it there? I mean, is it only David Roski's doing it? Where do you see it?
I would say that over the entire time, maybe also until now, sadly, Yiddish in general as one of the perspectives and voices in Yiddish literature in this area of Holocaust literature has been sidelined and neglected. Often scholars haven't paid attention, haven't used the sources, the texts, haven't spoken to survivors. I think it's getting better now, but for a long time, we see there were these big names like David Roskies who worked with these Yiddish texts, but it were only a few, and especially also like historians and people in German studies neglected these sources and didn't really see the richness and the voices which are conveyed in Yiddish, and they didn't use these texts as, they didn't use them for their own value. They often saw it more as a part of a canon. For example, with the Sonderkommando testimonies, the Yiddish testimonies were always seen as part of the Sonderkommando, a canon seen with the work by, the testimony by Philipp Müller, for example. But I think we also see this a little bit in the translations, the versions and adaptations of Wiesel's Yiddish memoir and what actually gets out. And that Yiddish voices, if they are translated, for example, they have to fit into this universal paradigm, have to speak to the humanity, and often the distinguished Yiddish parts, the Jewish parts, the also religious parts are being edited out or flatlined. So it reaches a broader audience. I think this is what we can still see in scholarship, but also in earlier scholarships, what is happening to these Yiddish testimonies, Yiddish literature, for example.
I would also add that Yiddish scholarship on Holocaust literature, Yiddish language scholarship, has also been missed by the field. That you gave these years, the 70s, the 80s, and so on, but I can think of works that were published in the 50s and the 60s that were doing a lot of these movements already, thinking about a kind of, not a coherent or a cohesive canon, but these concepts of literature that is trying to think about these experiences that we call the Holocaust, published, in Poland by David Svard, or different studies by different folks there who are really active both as creative writers. Svard was also a poet, but he was also a publisher and an editor, so these figures who have multiple communal roles as well as artistic roles and scholarly roles. And in Buenos Aires as well, like Mark Turkov or Shmuel Rozhansky, who are also heading huge institutions like YIVO in Buenos Aires and also figures in New York. So there are also ways in which the fact that the scholarship on this subject is in Yiddish as well also made it a kind of peripheral set of materials, even though it was doing the thing that in some ways anticipated the field of Holocaust literary studies that came later.
So it's kind of a double forgetting, a double displacing, because it's both the literature itself and the scholarly work that was on the literature. Yeah.
I would echo everything you just said. The other thing that I might, there are also, if we think of like outside of the purely scholarly context, I think there were interesting initiatives around translation and around I think of some of Irina Klopfish's early work that was very scholarly, and not necessarily in the way that we think of article in a peer-reviewed journal, but was doing kind of recuperative work around writers, and I think on the edges of testimony, there's a lot people doing kind of active work with testimony, with interviewing survivors. Many of them were not thinking about Yiddish, but many of them were, and I think not just expanding the language as a scholarship, but also expanding beyond the university can I think open that up.
Okay, I have more questions, but I think I'll ask one and then open it up to the audience. What kinds of infrastructure currently exist to support Yiddish literary studies, and what would you like to see developed? If you could, have a massive budget and endless abilities to hire and create centers, and what would you like to see developed? What could help, really sort of solidify and in this literary canon in ways that would take it forward into the future?
I have to coo a little. Rochelle is our new assistant professor in comparative literature at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where we successfully campaigned for a Yiddish literary scholar, and we were lucky enough to get Rochelle. And the argument that was made, yes, I made it, was Yiddish is a global language. You're interested in global diaspora? Study Yiddish. And lo, we have a student from, where is she from? I won't mention her name, our graduate student, who suddenly upped and got interested in Yiddish.
Yeah, where's she from?
Where is she from? Perhaps Taiwan, perhaps China. She suddenly decided she needed not only to study Chinese and Japanese, but Yiddish. I have a graduate student who does Yiddish and Japanese, in addition to the graduate student we share. So open-minded higher education institutions that are not going to look at bean counting only and say, wow, a stateless language that incorporates multiple other languages into itself and is easier than Russian, Arabic, and Chinese? Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Well, and certainly for me, Yiddish is like the prime place that, you know, the kind of prime example for comparative literature, right? It's like inherently transnational, inherently dialoguing with other languages, always has. So it's precisely in comparative literature departments that you can see the future.
I mean, where I see space for improvement. I think a lot of students who come with great enthusiasm are limited by the lack of language learning opportunities, and certainly that's a challenge because you have to have the right amount of numbers and teachers and so on. And so, I mean, as much as possible, I always encourage my students to take advantage of summer intensives, which do a really great and important job, not only of helping students develop those linguistic skills, but also of creating a network among students. I mean, YIVO program here has some great alumni, but of course, I think students run into the issue of funding, which is always a problem. And so if I had all the resources ever, I do think that that would be very important, because only if you have the linguistic skills can you actually access these things that are not translated, which is precisely what we've been saying, right? This is the real problem with Yiddish in this particular field of Holocaust studies, is the linguistic barrier.
And you can translate them, as people are doing as well.
Yeah.
Okay, perhaps we have some questions out here. Maybe I'll bring my microphone. Oh, you've got one, good, okay. Corey, why don't we start with you? I don't think I need a mic. You do for Zoom.
Oh, I do for Zoom.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I hate microphoning, but okay. So we're phoning it in. I wanted to go back to your question, Erin, about circulation, and I just wanted to bring up like this idea of, for example, Bergelsen and his inner warriors in Weimar, in Berlin. And I'm thinking of like, is there a way to think about one of the things we haven't quite touched on yet, which we've been talking a lot about the politics and the scope of a lot of things, but is there another way to think about this that's from an aesthetic point of view? So like aesthetic overlaps that maybe could be a part of the circulation. I mean, I'm also thinking of the enormous influence that Kafka has, and not necessarily, I mean, I don't know what Kafka's exact role plays in Yiddish literature, but I mean, this sort of opens up this line of thinking, this kind of, in this case, this idiom of modernism, of literary modernism, and does that also have, you know, like can that kind of turn the conversation in a slightly different way? I'm just wondering.
Well, since it's Bergelsen, yes, Bergelsen, the hunger artist, directly influenced Bergelsen's stories for $40, He'll Fast, and I don't remember the rest of the title. Walt Whitman was a great favorite of everyone who was a modernist, including Yiddish modernists. So Melich Ravitch wrote about Walt Whitman. So I think, again, if we put authors like Bergelsen in comparative literature classes together with Virginia Woolf and Franz Kafka and other writers, we take away the sting, oy vey, it's in Yiddish, I don't know anything about it. Oh no, it's a modernist work of literature like Polish modernism, like Russian modernism, like English modernism, like Japanese modernism. And I think the aesthetic interconnections, absent this one went and talked to the other one, are really the way to go, and that's what I emphasize in all of my work.
Annie has a question
there. Thank you so much. This was really, really interesting and engaging. One thing that I thought we could bring up was also disgust and active rejection. So there was a lot of talk about like kind of forgetting Yiddish or sidelining Yiddish, but Yiddish is also actively rejected, and certain kinds of Yiddish are also actively rejected. So, I mean, Yad Vashem shames its Yiddish Holocaust survivor scholars publicly in newspapers and makes fun of them for not knowing Hebrew well enough. Doesn't fund Nachman Blumenthal's Yiddish project, funds his German project. Even in Ketsetnik, you mentioned that Ketsetnik's House of Dolls was published by the Argentinian press, Das Polnische Judentum, but Salamandra was rejected because it was too disgusting. And Ketsetnik incorporates this. He says, I know what I'm writing is disgusting and you're going to turn your nose up at it, but I have to write this way. And even Hay Leivik was disgusted by Holocaust Yiddish, Churban Yiddish. So I was wondering if you could, I know that, I think there's, maybe be less polite. I mean, it's not, I think maybe in Canada, it's like, you're just not that interesting. But in other, as Harriet knows, I was sitting next to her as I was translating, the trial of these, of Elias Spivak, who's killed for being a Yiddishist. So I feel like there's a little bit more of an active rejection and disgust than just kind of like, whoopsie daisies, it's not German. And by the way, there's also a summer program in Tel Aviv that you can send your students to.
I think a lot plays into why Yiddish is so sidelined. And if we think about it, it starts right after the Holocaust. Think about Avram Sutzkever wasn't allowed to speak in Yiddish at the Nuremberg trial. He had to speak in Russian. What it actually means that a survivor couldn't speak in his language. He had to use another language, and that there was like a censorship on certain languages and voices and perspectives. We have to also think about, if we think about translation and how people actually can voice their experience, it's about what's getting lost in translation, what is getting lost due to the untranslatable factor, to what is lost because of connotations. There is also a huge factor about the language itself, which plays into this, but also, you're totally right, there is this censorship about Yiddish, which is not letting survivors speak at trials in their languages, but also later in publications and stuff. And this is something we have to take into account if we think about also what's getting out, what is accessible to readership in general, and then also to a wider audience. So there is this huge aspect of what gets out, what is circulated also.
Well, certainly, early Israel, the rejection, the strong rejection, but also in the United States, right? Where you have this, as Rochelle said, this readership moving away from Yiddish. Well, Yiddish is seen as old-fashioned and, not the ticket to the American dream. And it's seen, how many students come to your classroom saying, and I've heard this so many times over the years, well, what I know about Yiddish is an oral language, right? Like that is, and these are American Jews who, that's what they bring with them. And that is a kind of a disgust, a kind of a rejection as well. So, and in Europe, certainly, Yiddish after the Holocaust is seen as unseemly, or maybe it's the return of the repressed. I don't know. I think, honey, you should write a whole psychoanalytic study of this because I think it has. But there's a lot there, and I don't. In the Soviet Union, perhaps it's got its own character as well.
Low prestige.
Yeah, low prestige, right.
But what feeds into this, I think, is that Yiddish often, for a long time, had a bad reputation, was seen as weak, as feminine, as feminized, as this language of the shtetl Jews who are not strong enough. I think it also feeds into this narrative of Israel, of these muscle Jews. So there's a lot about gender also involved in this. But Yiddish had a bad reputation already before the Holocaust in some circles, not in all, but I think after the Holocaust it just continues and all these different aspects come together. It's about what is universalized, what is fitting into this westernized perspective, into the Americanized perspective of Holocaust memory. There are a lot of different aspects coming together. Why Yiddish is not one of the prominent languages in Holocaust literature, unfortunately, even though a lot of the victims of the Holocaust were speaking Yiddish.
So I think we have a question up here. No, I think you had your hand up for a long time, so.
Thank you. So thank you for this wonderful panel. I was wondering if any or all of you wanted to discuss one of my own obsessions is genre and genre slippage that occurs with some of these texts, especially when they're in a, let's say, obscure or marginalized language like Yiddish. When you mentioned earlier Wiesel's Und die Welt hat geschwiegen versus its kind of reincarnation as night, those two books to me read not just very differently, and Und die Welt hat geschwiegen is much longer, but it's also much more documentary, testimonial, autobiographical. And Night is written or is re-edited in a way that makes it more novelistic. And people and international readers seem to have responded to that novelistic, fictionalized retelling much more powerfully than I would imagine if there were a direct translation of the Yiddish text that they would. And as a kind of example of that resonance and the ability of Yiddish to kind of slip in and out of genre expectations because of its marginality would be another text also published in Buenos Aires, Josso Rockover Retzu God, which Zvi Kolitz wrote in New York as fiction, but what was published by Sutzkever in Die Goldene Kate as nonfiction, right? Where a text that is so difficult for people outside of the language to access can kind of make of it whatever they will as it then gets translated and the name of the author is removed or changed. So I'm wondering if there's something to be said about the audiences or the reading public's expectations and demands of what the text has to say and what it's supposed to be beyond the obscurity or lack of access of the Yiddish language.
That's a really good question. I think, yeah, how the text is formed and edited and translated has to do with the target audience. So La Nuit was especially for a French Christian audience, which was used to a certain French style. So this is why it was shaped differently. It has a totally different beginning than Und die Welt hat geschwiegen. So yeah, I think with these genres, it often has the audience in mind, but I think also we tend to think in boxes, which make it somehow tricky for literature and also limits literature in itself, because there is this discussion about what Wiesel's Yiddish memoir actually are, or also about Night. Is it fictional? Is it non-fictional? Is it a testimony? Is it a memoir? What is it? Is it a novel? What's going on? And I think literature actually, we think about it, it opens the field to be everything. It can be everything at all. It can be part of it or nothing at all. And we as humans, we want easy answers often, makes it easier for us. But I think actually literature gives us the playing field to do all of this, and that's the beauty of literature. But it makes it hard for a certain audience, especially if it's a wider audience, a non-academic audience, for example, then it's getting really tricky because it has to fit in certain boxes of what is also, for example, for a German audience, it would be I think a memoir, and in an American audience, it would just on the title, on the cover page, it would has a different genre. So it also changes with the language and the audience. So it's really tricky, but yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's actually a shame that we have these boxes and literature has to fit in where it can be so much more, and it can actually be a testimony and also fictional.
Well, I think the slippage is a very interesting way to think about this, which you mentioned, and I think Kristen also. Two works come to mind that were published in Poland. The first was Malka's Ghetto, Ghetto Kingdom, which was published by Shaya Spiegel, which was the first, officially the first work of the first book published in liberated Poland. And the publishers talk about the reason they chose this book was because it was a work of art, that it was aesthetic. And it's a collection of short stories, and it's been translated now into English. And essentially, it could read either as a testimony about life in the Łódź ghetto, and it's also aesthetic, so is it fiction? It really blurs the boundary between fiction and nonfiction, and it's that exact thing that Spiegel's doing that made it an attractive choice to be the first thing that the press wanted to put out, because their mission wasn't just to publish everything or to publish testimony or to publish literature as literature, but to both commemorate or to remember these horrific events, and then also to make literature, to make art. And so this is a way in which those are working together. And then I'm also thinking of a book they published a few years later. It was a reprint, which the politics of the reprint are something we've touched on a little bit, and I think they're worth getting into. But this was a reprint of a work of children's literature called I Will Tell You a Story. It was by Ber Sarin, and you can look, the Yiddish Book Center digitized it in full color. It's really beautiful. And the stories inside are cute little rhymes and poems about life on a farm, and Vetter Spetter, who is a man who's always late for everything, and just really charming, cute kids' literature. But it includes this introduction by Hersch Smolar, which is all about how Ber Sarin was a man of the people and a teacher in Vilna, and he was part of Young Vilna. And then he gets into detail about how Ber Sarin was murdered by the Nazis in the work for children. And I think that it lays on top of this otherwise kind of happy, banal text, this memorial testimony framework that makes the book not just a work for children, but also a kind of memorial piece that fits then within this context of Holocaust literature. So it already blurs those lines even in this kind of work.
I just want to add that the Eastern European Russian context is much more tolerant of the loose, baggy monster than the American English or French market. And documentaryism is, of course, coming back, is with us today, and it's been with us for decades in other languages, in other contexts.
Okay, I think we have one more question here, and then it's down here, actually. Or was there somebody up there? Oh, sorry, two more questions. I don't want to.
Hi, a general question and a specific question for Harriet. I don't know if you have these numbers, but in thinking about circulation, I was wondering if you had a sense of the general size of the print runs and the changes in them. And just in the size of the print runs for fiction relative to other things, like what is the largest print run for any Yiddish book in these years? And specifically for Harriet, I mean, I was curious about the changing fortunes of Yiddish publication in the Soviet Union. Is it following the logic of language and publication politics in the Soviet Union, that it's just generally, like if a book is translated, it's translated into Ukrainian, it's going to be translated into all the languages of it, or is Yiddish considered a special case? And I understand that you want to bracket the ideological readings, but can you bracket the politics of publication and the rising fortunes? 61 is a notable year in many ways. So I wondered if you could give a context of, Yiddish publication in the context of just Soviet publication generally.
So Matt, you mentioned Holocaust literature as commodity earlier, and I think this is an interesting question about the Yiddish literary market as a market. So to answer the question about print runs, this is just sort of ballpark, but Das Polnische Judentum, the early print runs, they maybe had 5,000, and some of them were sold out, and some of them had second editions. And then, of course, as the years went on, those were much smaller. And in Poland as well, they were 2,000, 3,000. These were small print runs by our standards, but in the post-war period, these were for Yiddish anyway. That's a lot. But then the question of the commodity and the market, I think, complicates this, because oftentimes these books were sold by way of subscription. And people subscribed to support the press, not necessarily because they wanted to read the book, but because they wanted to support the project. And they wanted to demonstrate their commitment to Yiddish culture, whatever that meant to them personally. Or in some cases, they felt coerced, that they wanted to be part of a cooperative in Wrocław or something. And in order to be a good member of the cooperative, you had to also subscribe to the Yiddish press. So these are complicating factors because it's hard to say exactly how many people read the books, even if they owned the books, but maybe they just sat on the shelf, and maybe that meant something to them too, because they could point to Yiddish literature on their shelf, and that designated that they were, in communication in some way with this kind of cultural heritage. So it's a bit complicated when we think about the commodity of Yiddish literature in this period.
I don't have print runs, but Gennady Estreich does, if you want to ask him. And I think in the early 60s, the Soviet Union felt pressured to show that Jews had a home in the Soviet Union as well as in the United States and Israel. And so the situation of Yiddish publication and Yiddish translation into Russian would have been different from, say, publication in Kazakh and translation into Russian.
Okay, and we have one more question here.
It's late. I wanted to ask maybe the obvious, and it's been already touched upon tangentially, and that is the politics of the Yiddish language in the literature written in Yiddish, considering that, as we know, Jews in Eastern and Central Europe were all multilingual, and so were all of these authors. So is it self-evident that this literature was written in English, or perhaps some of them wrote in different languages? I know of at least one that I'm working on that would have liked to write in Yiddish. However, her Polish was much better. That's what she learned in school. So it was a choice, a commitment perhaps to write in one language, but not the other, or perhaps there were some who wrote in both languages. Or for instance, I think Volksstimmer was published both in Polish and in Yiddish, and then would publish works that were written in Polish, or in both Yiddish and Polish. So that multilingualism, I think, is important, and all these kind of translatory exchanges that inform that literature written in Yiddish. So can we really isolate, Yiddish literature per se, if it's so implicated in that cauldron of languages that existed?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I think it's hard to generalize because I think for each individual, right? But there's for many writers, there was clearly a very conscious choice to write in Yiddish, and often they would reflect on it, about the conscious choice to write in the language of so many who had been killed. But I also think even when that choice was made, often the literary production was much more multilingual. I think Rosenfarb's a case in point, where she's writing in Yiddish, but she's also writing quite a lot in English. And going back to this question about genre and these kind of, hybrid texts that are maybe more acceptable in an Eastern European context. But Rochel Auerbach comes to mind as someone who wrote intensive, actually really strange, in a good way, strange texts that were also not just crossing generic borders, but were also thinking about what it meant to do that, in a very kind of self-conscious way. But she was writing in multiple languages, right? And in Polish and Yiddish and Hebrew. And I think this is not unusual. And it's I do think maybe there's, there is also a danger in focusing too much on the Yiddish exception, and trying to resituate them in this larger, more multilingual milieu is crucial.
I think we need to keep Yiddish, as a separate language. I mean, the author I've worked on the most said that his Yiddish sounded funny to readers because he was, in a way, translating conversations that would have been had in Russian back into Yiddish, and that's Bergelson.
Okay, well, I just want to conclude by saying, what I'm taking away in part as a scholar of the Holocaust, not as a Yiddishist, from this panel is the humility that we as scholars of Holocaust literature should feel about this very complex interplay of languages, of complex literatures, and especially the work in Yiddish. There's this Cambridge History of Holocaust Literature that this team is editing. We keep adding more Yiddishists because we recognize that the canon of Holocaust literary studies hasn't adequately responded, and we need to make sure that Yiddish is robustly represented in both in Holocaust literary studies and in the canon of Holocaust literature. And I suppose my evangelical takeaway that we all should go out into the world is to not forget this, that this is a really important aspect. And those of us who work on the Holocaust, this is something that we ourselves can do. Even those of us who aren't Yiddishists can do some of the work and support our Yiddishist colleagues. I want to thank our panelists very much. Thank you for getting our workshop started. And thank you again to UFO for hosting us.